this story is a tragedy. So if we're going to look at it thematically, we've got to talk about it in terms of tragedy. It's not a comedy, obviously. Which leads to questions like, well, what makes it tragic? Aristotle would say, from his analysis of plays, that what is often tragic is where the main character has some sort of flaw, or he's aiming at the wrong thing. That's the origin of that term. So we have to think, well, what is Oedipus's real flaw here? He gets caught up in this investigation. He's searching for the murderer of the king, and he's doing the best he can. He just doesn't know what he has done in the past has led him to this point. And so that's something that I think students you could have a really good discussion about, is, well, what is his flaw? Is he at fault for what has happened here? Because when we think of tragic stories, it's easy to think of a lot of characters throughout history who have caused their own downfall. Shakespeare's examples are the easiest ones. You think of King Lear or Othello, these giant characters in literary history. They're the problem. They cause it. We can see the actions they take cause to the crumbling of the story and the destruction, usually, of everyone around them. Oedipus's actions leads to various forms of destruction, and everything turns out pretty bad at the end. But there's still some debate over whether all of this is his fault. I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on whether you think he's to blame for what ends up happening to him.
Yeah, and that's a tough one, because some people would say, well, this was prophesied and so fated in some way.
Sure.
So he had no control over his actions. But fate, understood in that sense, means there's going to be a particular end, and every way you try to avoid it, you will still end up in the same place.
Right.
And the process by which he comes to this end, I think, is revealing of quite a few flaws in Oedipus. He's supposed to be the rational one, the one who solves riddles.
Right.
And yet he isn't interested, or he doesn't worry too much about the riddle of his own existence, because that's what starts him out on this whole thing, right? Someone at a party says, your parents aren't your real parents. And so he goes to the oracle to find out, are those my real parents, the king and queen of Corinth? And the oracle says, you're going to kill your father and marry your mother. And so he so he had this doubt about who his parents are. But once he gets that prophecy, all of a sudden he's certain again of who his parents are. Right. He kind of forgets about that part. So he's got this sort of, this desire, this insatiable thirst for truth, but he's often narrow-minded in that he's not looking around at what other truths he should be searching for.
Right. Yeah, his intelligence, as strange it might be to say, his intelligence might be his greatest downfall, because he thinks he has all the answers. His over-reliance on his own intellect might be his actual downfall. And in fact, often the wisest thing anyone can do is to step back and say, you know what? I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to hear all the options. And for a while, he's not willing to do that.
Right.
You bring up the idea of his own existence or his own place, and we see that right from the beginning. Since we're on the text section here, the opening paragraph of the play, his opening speech, he says, "I, Oedipus, whom all men call the Great." So from the get-go, he has almost named himself. He determined his own existence in this situation, which would be very different for a lot of people throughout all of history, not just ancient Greek, where you are born into a place. You are, kind of maybe cursed or chained to your family name. You are born into aristocracy or a position of power. And so you're kind of defined by your circumstances. He's a guy who has made his own life, right? I mean, he's left his hometown. He has solved the problem, the riddle for this other town, and has become their king. He's a self-made man in
Right.
that new town, and so he can define for himself who he is. The problem is he doesn't fully know who he is, and so that's the eternal dilemma of life and literature and all of art: is, do you actually know who you are?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why this story has existed for so long. That's the ultimate question, and it starts from the first paragraph that Oedipus starts speaking.
Right. And it's humorous that at the oracle at Delphi, when you enter,
Yes.
there is written, "Know thyself."
Right.
Right. And he mocks Tiresias for not solving the riddle. He says, "I solved the riddle. Obviously, I know truth." And Tiresias says, "There's a one riddle you haven't solved that you kind of gave up on."
Yeah.
And that's the riddle you should be paying attention to.
That question is the fundamental question, because I think it's the only thing that illustrates our consciousness,
Mhm.
right? That we can actually analyze who we are and our place in existence. Other animals don't do that. Some animals can kind of do a little bit of it. They know that they're an individual entity. They know they have a place in their social system. They can even show the beginnings of empathy towards other animals like themselves. Like, they can do some of those basic things. But we're the only creatures that actually take that question and can have the capability of exploring it. Do you know who you actually are and what you're doing here? And I think that's when it says in Scripture that we are made in the image of God, I think that's what it means, is that you have been given consciousness like God has, to be able to define who you are, and for us, what your relationship is with our Creator. And that's the thing people spend most of their lives trying to solve. And this is played out in dramatic form, but we do the same thing.
Right. And one consequence of the technology that we have today is that we can avoid knowing ourselves. Our attention can always be outward and never inward, because we have something to watch, something
Sure.
to read, something to look at.
It's human nature to seek an understanding of ourselves by way of how others interact with us, or what is shown to us, or what the broader culture kind of mirrors back at us. That's completely normal. The problem is when that becomes the only thing we're examining, right? That we are only viewing ourselves in terms of what the other person or the rest of the world might see in us, and we live according to that, instead of taking a step and saying, no, who am I actually as my own person and in relationship with my Creator? We can't avoid our social lives. We're around other people, and that's perfectly normal. But who we are and to truly know ourselves is a much more complicated thing than we often realize.
Right. And with something like Facebook, you don't just have the social interaction. Basically, your whole view of yourself is determined by what
Right.
others are saying about you, which is one reason why I think the suicide rate has doubled for teenage girls since the invention of Facebook. There's no getting away from other people's view of you.
Right. Well, and that leads to, it can lead to two extremes, right? It can lead, and everything in between, obviously. It can lead to, I have a higher view of myself than I probably should. I, Oedipus, whom they call the Great, like you can develop that hubris, or you can think really low of yourself, which is equally as bad, obviously. So, if we're not truly determining who we are and what our place is and what our purpose is and what the meaning of all of this is, yeah, we can be led to some pretty dark places. And Oedipus thinks he's trying to find out who he is, when at many of the turns in the play, people are giving him warnings, Tiresias especially, who's like, I could give you the truth, but I don't think you're ready for it. And when he ultimately does, he doesn't believe him, right? Because again, he thinks he's smarter.
Right.
And having the wisdom to actually embrace your ignorance, to say, wow, I didn't know that. I'm willing to examine that part of me. is actually the beginning of wisdom.
Right. Yeah, that's, he is not kind to Tiresias when he tells him, "You're the murderer," and he accuses him of conspiring with Creon. And so Creon comes, and clearly in that situation, he thinks he is infallible.
Yeah.
Because Creon says, "Stop and reason through it." And that's a theme that becomes apparent then, is you're supposed to be this person who solves riddles, and yet you've given up reason altogether.
Right.
Instead, emotion is driving all your thoughts because, well, you don't need reason since you pretty much know everything.
Yeah. Sort of an interesting biblical parallel, like, come let us reason together, that we're supposed to be thinking things through in a logical way, that there is an order to things if we are willing to look at it. Yeah, Oedipus, he can see, but obviously he is blind. And, this is where you've said in your other courses and other discussions where, what Socrates discusses about the unexamined life. Like, his job is to examine his life, and he's not willing to actually do that. So when we talk about the tragedy of this story and what makes it a tragic play, yeah, the circumstances in the play, could he have done things differently? Well, of course, if the oracle says, that you're going to kill someone, maybe no matter what situation you're in, you probably shouldn't kill someone to try to avoid that. But even if those circumstances still come about, his real downfall is that he's not willing to examine himself. And that leads to the tragic consequences at the end.
Right. Because when he's speaking with Jocasta after his argument with Creon, and he's angry because Tiresias is a prophet and has prophesied that he's the murderer, Jocasta says, "Don't worry about prophets. They're a bunch of hogwash." Right? And she says, "Let me tell you a story. My husband, when I was married to Laius, we gave birth to a baby boy, but the prophet said that he would end up killing his father. So Laius drove a nail through his feet and left him out in the elements to die from exposure." I don't understand why at that point Oedipus doesn't say, "Wait a second.
I have a bum leg. I should know that."
Yeah. And I mean, was it common at that time for people to be told that they're going to kill their father and marry their mother? He should have thought, well, that's a coincidence that we have the same prophecy.
Yeah,
here.
Maybe don't marry a woman who is that much older than you, just to be on the safe side, right?
Right. Yeah. And so he gets so bent on whether he's the murderer of Laius, he completely ignores all these clues that he is fulfilling the prophecy until the very end, until the messenger says, "These aren't your real parents, right? The parents in Corinth, they adopted you."